For this homework assignment, you are asked to identify the antecedent and consequent in each of the following statements. Then put the statement into standard form if it is not already in standard form. Beginning with problem number 2. You lose the point if you miss the second try. The antecedent for this is you miss the second try. The consequent is you lose the point. And this, when you put it into standard form, would be if you miss the second try, then you lose the point. And notice here that this proposition, as it's written here in the initial presentation, it's P if Q. And the way we put P if Q into standard form is we swap the order in which these occur. Number 3, if a categorical syllogism has two negative premises, then it is not valid. And this one, the antecedent is a categorical syllogism has two negative premises. The consequent is it is not valid. And this is already in standard form, so you didn't have to change anything. Number 4, a married couple filing a joint return may deduct certain child care expenses if they itemize their deductions. And this, the antecedent is they itemize their deductions, and the consequent is a married couple filing a joint return may deduct certain child care expenses. And to put this into standard form, you'd write it in the following way. If a married couple filing a joint return itemize their deductions, then they may deduct certain child care expenses. Now, I know that this is worded a little bit differently than how I have the antecedent and consequent worded up here. What I did in this is I could have left it these statements worded just as they are. These propositions I could have just left. I could have written if they itemize their deductions, then a married couple filing a joint return may deduct certain child care expenses. What I did though is I just took married couple filing a joint return and I substituted it in place of they right here. So I just did that for stylistic reasons. But if you had written if they itemize their deductions, then a married couple filing a joint return may deduct certain child care expenses. If you had worded it like that, that's perfectly fine. But the they here, it refers to married couple filing a joint return. But you have to keep in mind too that they refers to this entire expression, a married couple filing a joint return. It's not just a married couple, it's a specific kind of married couple, namely those filing a joint return. But this is this sentence up here, this is to put it in standard form like as I've done it here. Like I said, if you had worded it a little bit differently, if instead of taking married couple filing a joint return and using that in place of they, if you had just said if they itemize their deductions, then a married couple filing a joint return, blah, 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 blah. If you had written it that way, that's perfectly fine too. So the only modification I made is I just began with married couple filing a joint return instead of they. Like I said, for stylistic reasons, nothing else. Number 5. People will want to protect animals in nature only if they can form a connection to animals at the zoo. And the antecedent to this is people will want to protect animals in nature, and the consequent is they can form a connection to animals at the zoo. And notice at the top, it doesn't say if, it says only if. So when it says only if, what it's basically saying is what comes after that is a requirement. People will want to do X only if this other thing occurs. People will want to protect animals only if. That means this is a requirement. And if this is a requirement, they can form a connection at the zoo. If that's a requirement, that makes it the consequent, which means it comes after the then part of the if-then statement. So this is how we would put the proposition in the standard form. If people want to protect animals in nature, then they formed a connection to animals at the zoo. You know, here I did have to change they can form to they formed. That's just for stylistic reasons. If you had written it they then they can form something like that, that would have been okay too. You know, you just sometimes putting these in the standard form, you have to modify the tense of certain words, certain verbs in order to get the statement to just sound natural. But what is important for our purposes for you to recognize is the statement as it's initially presented is of the form P only if Q. And whenever you see only if, basically you just leave everything in place. and you just say if people want to protect animals in nature, then they can form a connection, or they did form a connection to animals at the zoo. So P only if Q, that's a non-standard form. Standard form would be if P then Q. Prices rise if demand increases. And in this one, the antecedent is demand increases. The consequent is prices rise. And to put this into standard form is just if demand increases, then prices rise. That one was pretty easy. Okay, this one is going to be tricky. This one's actually fairly tricky, but we'll see what we can do with it. So, average levels of education in Ethiopian villages will increase if and only if the people have access to clean water. Now, I'm going to show you the answer to this one differently than I have in the previous ones, because in this one, this sentence here is actually asserting two distinct propositions. The first one is going to be, and we have to go up here and look at this, if and only if. This is saying two different things. One thing it's saying is average levels of education in Ethiopian villages will increase if people have access to clean water. So just ignore the and only if. Ignore that for a second. It's saying average levels of education in villages will increase if people have access to clean water. So it's saying P if Q. And the way that we show this is we would say the first thing, if people have access to clean water, then average levels of education in Ethiopian villages increase. And we get that from if. P if Q, but it's also saying and only if, which means it's setting up this proposition right here that people will have access to clean water as a necessary condition, as a requirement. So it's also saying the following: if average levels of education in Ethiopian villages increase, then people have access to clean water. So it's actually asserting two different propositions here, and you get proposition one from if, and you get the second proposition from only if. And so basically what we're doing is we're combining those two sentences we've seen already. We've seen P if Q, we've seen P only if Q, and we're combining those, P if and only if Q. And from that we get two different propositions. Now, what's the antecedent? Well, it depends on which proposition we're talking about. If we're talking about proposition one, then the antecedent is people have access to clean water, and we see that down here. And the consequent of that is going to be average levels of education in Ethiopian villages will increase. If we're talking about proposition 2, then we have a different antecedent, which is average levels of education in Ethiopian villages will increase, and we have a different antecedent. So this one was probably the trickiest one because we hadn't dealt with one like this in the previous video lecture. If you didn't get this one, that's not a huge deal. The more important thing I want you to see is that if you look up here, if represents one proposition and only if represents a different one. And so what is the antecedent and what is the consequent? Well, it depends on which of those two propositions we're talking about. One thing to keep in mind too is whenever you see an if and only if phrase like this, basically it's saying that these two different events coincide with one another. That means to say if average levels it will increase, then I also have access to clean water. And if you have access to clean water, average levels of education will increase. The P and Q, if one is true, the other is true. If one is false, the other is false. Those things always covary in an if and only if statement. Number 9, if you don't start saving now, then you will not be able to buy a car when you're 16. So what is the antecedent here and what is the consequent here? Well, here it is. The antecedent is you don't start saving now, and the consequent is you will not be able to buy a car when you're 16, and this is already in standard form. So this one, I guess, was maybe a little bit tricky because you're used to seeing one or propositions given that don't have negatives in them, but as long as, remember, what matters for standard form is not whether or not there's a negative that occurs as part of the antecedent or part of the consequent. What makes it standard form is that it's if, the antecedent, then, and then the consequent. And what makes something the antecedent is that it's establishing a sufficient condition for the consequent. It's establishing a sufficient condition for whatever it is that's supposed to follow from it. So That's what makes it the antecedent. And you can have an antecedent. Now, if we were to put this into symbolic form, using the P's and Q's, what we would say is if not P, then not Q. Now, we need to be clear about that. But the not P, that is the antecedent. And the not Q, that is the consequent. Number 11, I'll call you unless you call me first. This was also a tricky one in here because we have the non-standard expression for the hypothetical proposition, unless. And the consequent is you call me first. The antecedent is you call me first. The consequent is I'll call you. And the way we would write this is if you don't call me, then I'll call you. That's the standard form for this proposition. Like I said, whenever you come across unless, for me, I always, or not always, but a lot of times I have trouble putting it into standard form. So I'll always go back to the example that is very obvious to me what's being said, which is I'll die unless I have enough oxygen, which means if you don't have oxygen, then you will die, or if I don't have oxygen, then I will die. So if you ever see P unless Q, that's always if not P, then Q. That's how we would translate it. I will go to the party only if you go. So the antecedent is, in this one, I will go to the party. The consequent is you go. And then standard form is if I will go to the party, then, as a typo here, then you will go. Sorry about that, but it should say if I will go to the party, then you will go. So, all right, that one, I don't think that one was any different than ones we've also seen. But I will say this, you could have thought of it differently, and you might have thought of it in just the following way. You might have said, well, I will go to the party only if you will go. You might have thought of it like this. It was like, well, what that is saying is basically, if you will not go to the party, then I will not go. Notice, and that might be how some of you just naturally thought of it. Notice here that if this is the way you were thinking of it, that's fine. That is actually the contrapositive of the way I've written it here. Though this is really annoying me. I left out the word you here. But these are contrapositives of one another. And like I've said, when you have a hypothetical proposition, it has a logically equivalent contrapositive. So you may have, and some of you may have thought of it like this, because it's like, I will go to the party only if you go, which you might, I don't know, it seems kind of natural for me to think of that and just say, I'll go to the party only if you go. What that means is, if you don't go, I won't go, all right? If you will not go, or if you don't go, then I won't go. I mean, it seems like that's exactly what this sentence up here is saying. But if you say, if you will not go, then I will not go, the contrapositive of that would be, if I go, then you will go, or if I will go, you will go. So those are logically equivalent ways, different ways of saying the same thing, basically. All right. Number 20, this is the last one. We cannot change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies unless consumers do not value thinness. So the key word here is the word unless, right? And unless, we have P right here, and then P will be we cannot change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies, and Q is going to be consumers do not value thinness. Remember, if we see P unless Q, what we're saying is if not Q, then P. So the antecedent in this is going to be consumers do not value thinness. And the consequent is going to be we cannot change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies. Now, if we're going to put this into standard form, though, we have to keep something in mind, which is this right here, consumers do not value thinness, is negative. So if we have P unless Q, we have to, the standard form of P unless Q is if not Q, then P. So what if we say not consumers do not value thinness, consumers do not value thinness, right? Basically what we're saying is if consumers value thinness, then we cannot change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies. Notice that we are negating this right here. Again, let me use this little feature here. This is nice, if it'll come up. So we cannot change, oh man, that was poorly drawn. But this right here, what I have the brackets around, or the parentheses around, that is what we're going to say is P. and then unless, and then we're going to put parentheses around this. This is going to be Q. And like I said, if we say P unless Q, what that comes to is not Q, then, if not Q, then P. The only thing here is that our Q, so to speak, already contains a not within it. Right? So we're already saying not here. So right now, this is what we're saying. So this is hard to write with this stupid thing. P unless not Q. So if we're going to put P unless not Q into standard form, basically what we're going to say is if not Q, then P. I know on none of my student evaluations is anyone going to say, man, Professor Newton sure is good at writing. Because remember, whenever you have P unless Q, you basically what you do is you negate what comes after unless. You negate this right here. That's what you're going to negate. So if you're negating not, well, what is not? You just, those cancel out, right? Double negatives cancel out. We're just stuck with Q. So if Q, then P. So if we're negating consumers do not value thinness, what would that be to negate it? Consumers do value thinness. So if consumers value thinness, then we cannot change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies. We could also write this, which would probably be less intuitive. We could write the contrapositive of this, which would be, let's see, it would be if we can change the fashion industry's presentation of impossibly thin bodies, then consumers do not value thinness, right? In that case, we take the negative of this, we negate this, and we negate this right here, and we'd swap those around. So that's another way we could express it. If you didn't get that, don't worry about it. It's not important. But the thing I want you to see with this particular exercise is that we are beginning with something that occurs right here, a proposition that's already negative. And if we have P unless Q, the way we show P unless Q, the way we put that in a standard formula is to say not Q, if not Q, then P. But if the Q was already negative to begin with, then we have to negate a negative, and to negate a negative gives you a positive, right? It's just that is one place where it is helpful to think about math a little bit, because if you have not Q, well, that just is Q. This one was a little tricky, this last one, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me about anything with regard to this.